Welcome back to the Oscar Project Podcast, the show where I discuss Oscar-nominated films year by year. I am your host, Jonathan Eterberg, and today I'm bringing you an interview with Jake Wachtel, director of the short film, The Sentry. Before I jump into the interview, please be sure to subscribe to the show in your podcast player so you can get all the newest episodes as soon as they are released. If you like the interview and want to hear more, please consider leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Jake Wachtel began his career making short documentaries for nonprofits and social impact ventures working in the Global South. In 2015, he moved to Cambodia to teach a year-long class in filmmaking to children as part of the Filmmakers Without Borders initiative. There, he developed his first feature, Karmalink, a Buddhist sci-fi set in the community where he taught and produced with a majority Cambodian cast and crew, including some horror students. He joins me on the podcast to talk about his latest short film, The Sentry. Jake, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So The Sentry is a really great concept. It's a blend of action and some supernatural elements. Where did the idea for this crazy story come from?
I had for a while in my mind kicking around an idea of wanting to get to know one of the nameless anonymous henchmen that always bites the dust in the opening minutes of a Bond film. I've always felt, I love those movies, but I've always felt that it's kind of harmful to the human soul to just witness so much casual death. And so that seed was was there for some time. And I've been in Cambodia for over a decade now. And I spent a good chunk of that time making my first feature film. And at some point after making that, I was trying to figure out what to do next. And I realized that there's something to the seed when I put it together, when I set it in Cambodia, and I realized Cambodians love ghosts. Ghost stories are probably the most common, movies made for the local market. And so there was that aspect that I was like, well, what if we got to know this henchman who died through his ghost? And then I also like that idea because I feel like there's something in the same way that movies treat those anonymous, nameless henchmen, stripping them of their humanity. There's something similar for the way that the West might think about people who live in a place like Cambodia, say the workers in a garment factory who become sort of anonymous cogs in the wheels of global capitalism. So those things were all bounced around in my mind and they congealed to form this story. I also knew I wanted to do something with an action scene in it and wanted to do something that was more comedic than my feature film. Yeah. So those things sort of crossed together.
That's really cool. And you mentioned getting to know that nameless henchman there. But also really appreciated how your spy Agent Blackwood, who kills the henchman at the beginning, not really a huge spoiler there, hopefully. He gets to display some kind of human emotions as he gets to know that character as well, which again we don't really get to see a lot with those Hollywood spy thrillers. Why was it important for that agent character to be able to feel and grow as a character throughout the film, as we get to know this henchman?
Yeah, I think that, I was interested in just sort of subverting what we normally think about the spy movie. It's a cliche that the spy is a lone wolf, doesn't like having partners, and likes to get in there and his sort of in the opening, he says, "The hell with discretion." To me, that sort of sums up how we're meant to view these guys who operate in their national interests, but sort of outside the law. And we root for these heroes to do that. And so I wanted a story where it sort of subverts that, calls into question that mode of being, and for the audience, and also hopefully have the spy start to go on that journey as well, as he's come face to face with the consequences of his actions.
Yeah, and tell me a little bit about casting both of those characters, Agent Blackwood and Termite, the henchman character, your title Sentry. How did you land on those actors for obviously very important roles that carry this film?
I have known Dada Pang, who plays the Sentry, for many years in Cambodia. He's primarily a martial artist, or he was. He's doing so much film stuff these days, but he's an amazing martial artist, and he competes, he teaches. And in Bokator, the tradition, working in the film industry in front of and behind the camera, he's a really great comedic actor. He does some fight choreography. And so I wrote the character with him in mind. I don't think that there's no one else, who could play that role besides him. So I wrote it with him in mind, and I was very lucky that he was down to do it, because I don't know what I would have done if he hadn't been. Yeah, and so then it was looking for someone to play his foil in The Spy. And well, I found Daniel through he was a friend of a friend, basically. And he's also a really great comedic actor. And I think that I wanted to cast someone that could have a look where you're like you think that you're supposed to take him seriously. He's got that kind of like rugged, handsome spy, but a little bit past the prime of where we normally see our spies when we catch up with James Bond or whatever. So the idea was, yeah, a spy who's like a little bit past his prime, but still, everything works out for him in the field normally. And so he's like finally confronted by this anonymous henchman who's almost his match, and it kind of that's where things start to turn for him. But yeah, as I was saying, I wanted to cast someone who had comedy chops, which he had in spades, and have him play the character sort of more straight, but to let that comedy sort of shine through. And then it gets really emotional and sincere in the end. And it was honestly a bit of a gamble for me. I'd never see the Sentry Pong play that kind of thing before. He's never really been asked to play it, but I thought that he was really amazing anchoring that. And yeah, Daniel too was able to go to that place so readily. And so we got to really play with we did a lot of different takes of that very emotional scene so that we could calibrate it in the edit of like what is the right amount of emotion. But I was sort of amazed at how Daniel could like dial the amount of sadness that we see on his face, the amount of devastation, how he could turn that up and down.
Yeah, that's really cool. I also really liked how you present the film in three very distinct chapters. Each has what I feel is an entirely different mood. You got the action at the beginning, you got the travel part in the middle, and then you're just talking about the ending. How did you land on using this kind of presentation technique for the story?
I always knew that I wanted it to take two pretty big left turns in the story. I didn't actually initially envision it as chapter titles, and that was something that we found in the edit. It just sort of felt natural, but it was always a bit of an experiment of like tonally, can it work to have these three parts that that feel we're in the sort of cliche spy genre or like pastiche of a 70s spy kung fu kind of vibe, and then it gets into like a much more low-key road trip buddy comedy, and then coming into this place of like social drama and sincerity. And it felt like a bit of an experiment. I was curious to see if those things could hang together, and to be honest, it took some massaging in the edit to make something that felt like it worked all the way through. There were moments where there's a bit more levity in the end, or when we went more serious, or like we started more serious and we realized that there was there's a bit of like lightness that we needed to ride through the opening that could carry us into the middle part so that it felt more cohesive, that it wasn't so abrupt, the change. But I really like stories that surprise me where I can't tell where they're going, and that was a big goal in telling the story.
Yeah, you definitely took me on a journey with this one. I know you have some beautiful locations, especially during that buddy travel part in the middle of the film. Obviously, you spent a lot of time in Cambodia, so I'm assuming you know a lot of these locations from where you've been around. But what were some of the challenges in filming in these areas? Some of which look fairly remote.
Yeah, so a lot of the stuff we filmed around this little town in the south called Kampot, where I lived during the pandemic, and I used to go out on rides in the countryside on my moto and was sort of surreptitiously scouting without even realizing it, scouting for this movie, which didn't exist in my head yet. And that might have also been part of what fed like how it came together. For sure, the biggest challenge of filming out there, the villain's lair, we filmed up on top of this mountain called Bokor Mountain, which is only like an hour drive from the little town down below. So it wasn't too remote, but it was the buildings where we filmed were actually the former king's residence. And so we had
Oh,
to
wow.
get permission from several layers of government in order to be able to film there. And Sreilin Mia, our production manager, has actually worked on some other big things down there. So she had a pre-existing relationship with the people involved. And that was the only reason we stood a chance with doing that. But even so, it was right up until the last minute that we got our permission to go in and build the set there, the entrance to the lair, which meant that when we went on our tech scout, when we're like, making the final plan for what is production going to be like, you go with all of your crew members, with your production designer and your TP, and everyone's there. We actually scouted another location, which was inside a cave, which was like an hour in the other direction from the town, and made these like dual plans side by side. We hope we get to film this in the in the king's residence up on the mountain, but if we can't, then we're going to need to like readjust the set so that it can be in a cave. We need to redo the fight scene to make use of the space in the cave rather than the space inside this abandoned building. And we also, all of the auxiliary scenes where they're on the road trip also needed to be close by to that location. So we scouted for like 2 different movies at the same time because we didn't yet have permission. And so it took a lot of energy to do that. But I think that that's like, for me, one of the joys of shooting in Cambodia is that you have access to these amazing locations, and, having to stay flexible like that kind of comes with the territory. But on the plus side, we got to film the villain's lair in the former king's residence, which is just, to me, kind of insane.
I really like how you tackle the visual challenge of the Sentry's change throughout the film. Obviously, you used a lot of, I'm sure, makeup effects and also some visual effects. What sort of
Yeah.
challenges did that pose for a production like this?
Well, one thing is, on our first day of shooting is when we shot all of the road trip / outdoor stuff. And that was the hottest day on record in like recorded history in Cambodia.
Oh gosh.
And so dealing with sweat and makeup running was definitely a thing. That's all, even in the cool months, that's a thing in Cambodia because it never gets all that cold. Yeah, and it did take a couple of iterations to dial in the visual effects. At first, we were trying something like a bit more involved, and that wasn't working. And so then I had this idea that we were going to try to make it really mimic processes of like double exposure and kind of weird, trippy things that would be available to filmmakers in the 70s. And that wasn't really panning out. And so we just were like, okay, soft, glowing, golden light. But even then, for the storytelling of like how much he's fading at different moments and he has to like pulse back to full opacity, just took some patience and some iterating to land on a place that, for me, yeah, I wanted it to feel like subtle and beautiful and awe-inspiring. This idea of, the great beyond, of, the death is like a journey into the next realm, and that there's something beautiful in that, and in addition to being really sad.
Yeah. And I also really like touching on sound and music in films like these. I think you use music in a really good way to layer it on top of all these beautiful visual images that we've already talked about, and then combine that with the sound effects, the soundscape of the film. How did you land on building that soundscape and also some of the musical selections for the film that you used?
Yeah, well, a lot of the music in the first half is psychedelic rock from Cambodia in the 1960s. There's like a really big, cool scene there. I've always loved that music, but never had a project where it was totally appropriate. But then this one, when we found this cover of Bang Bang by Rosteri Sotia, who's a singer active in the 1960s, it fits so perfectly, and it felt so fun to capture this tone. We wanted it to feel fun and familiar, but also filtered through the lens of Cambodia. And we worked with a sound outfit in Vietnam called RA Sound. It's 2 French brothers and a Vietnamese team that they're supervising. The process of, I think, kind of the biggest stuff were the scenes of the ghosts fading away. And we were just talking about the VFX side of it. I think, especially because we decided that we were going, something pretty simple and straightforward on the visual realm, that we wanted to really nail it in the realm of the sound design. And so that manifested as, again, wanting it to feel like there's something shimmery and beautiful and sort of awe-inspiring and otherworldly. And yeah, that was something that we were iterating on until our very last day of mixing, to really find the right meld of layers there. And for the music, I'm also a musician, and so for me it was really fun to work with our composer, who, yeah, for him, I knew that I just wanted, that was pretty minimal and leaning heavily into some textures that felt like warped tape, old synthesizer. And so something that felt like it could be coming from that era. Also, I really like the ghost theme, and we were inspired a lot by the soundtrack to the film After Yang, which is another one of my favorite sci-fi films. And so that was a big point of reference.
Fantastic. Well, I have a couple questions not specifically related to the film, but before I move on to those, is there anything else you want to touch on about the Sentry?
For me, one of my favorite parts of this whole experience was working with the Cambodian team that built the villain's lair. It was my first time constructing a set, and I didn't realize that there was a team there that could do something like this, but they were super pro. They built it out in Phnom Penh and then deconstructed it, put it on a truck, and the truck drove all the way up into the mountains. And they had, a very short period of time because of the whole permission thing that I was talking about before. And I'm just really proud of what they were able to pull off. It's been really gratifying showing it around to people in the film festival circuit, and and getting this feedback of like, how were you able to build that set? Yeah, I hope that watching this film, I love Cambodia. I've been there for 10 years. This film is in many ways a love letter to Cambodia, and I hope that comes across on the screen, but also just in the same way that I hope that people reconsider the henchmen, the Sentry, that people watching this can reconsider like what they might associate with Cambodia, what can be made in Cambodia.
Wonderful. Well, this might be the hardest question I asked, but if you had to pick your top 3 films of all time, what would they be?
Yeah, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind was I fell in love with filmmaking first and foremost as a magician. I was really into magic as a little kid and doing like trick photography, and Michel Gondry and his music videos were always kind of the apotheosis of like the kind of handmade magic that cinema could be. And in Eternal Sunshine, he marries it so expertly to a story with real heart. And The Bicycle Thieves, with a classic Italian realist. That one was very impactful on me. I was taking a class in Italian cinema before and after World War II, and we talked about how before the war it was very common. The most popular films were called white telephone comedies, and they were all about like the upper class comedies of manners, like very kind of floofy and inconsequential. Meanwhile, the country is suffering so greatly as Mussolini's rising to power, and things are really awful. And it was very much escapist. And then De Sica comes along and for the first time casts non-actors in the lead roles, makes this very social realist drama that's really elevating the common man and going out and filming on location, and has for me one of the great child performances of all time. And so I think that the ethos behind that has inspired me a lot as I've come to Cambodia. And a third film, I'll say Minority Report. I'm really a sci-fi guy through and through, and that was another one. And in my like formative days when I was deciding that I wanted to be a filmmaker, I think that the way that was like researched and cohesive and put together this world that really felt real in the future, but also had this sort of spiritual dimension to it. And just like for pure popcorn entertainment, I don't think it gets much better than that.
Yeah, that one definitely keeps moving. If you could invite any 3 movie characters to your next dinner party, who would they be and why?
The Tramp from any number of Charlie Chaplin. I don't know. It'd just be fucking hilarious.
He's always a lot of fun. Yeah.
Yeah. I think Baloo would be up there. Bare Necessities ranks as one of my all-time favorite songs. And I think would just love scratching my back on a post along with Baloo.
I have a feeling he would get along with the Tramp pretty well too.
Yeah, I think that would be and that makes me think that we need to round it out. This is technically a trio, also an oldie but goodie. So, but I hope it can count as one of my 3. It would be the Three Stooges. I spent a lot of time with my dad and watching Three Stooges growing up, and that was also the time when we would laugh the most. And I would love to see what that group of comic legends would do with Baloo and the Tramp.
Yeah, that'd be a lot of fun for sure. Do you have any books that you could recommend that you've read recently or really enjoying? They can be fiction or nonfiction and don't have to be related to movies.
I'm really into sci-fi. The Sentry is a bit of a departure from my normal interests. I made a Buddhist sci-fi film in Cambodia, and I'm developing a couple of other sci-fi projects And my feature film was inspired by a novel called Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. That is, I like really humane sci-fi that has like human, and that book is really high concept. But the sci-fi is kind of humming in the background, and it's about these three kids growing up in a boarding school in the UK in the 1970s in a kind of alternate reality where there are clones that are raised to have their organs harvested. So it's pretty gnarly premise, but really sort of gentle and beautiful and human. And Richard Powers is another one of my favorite sci-fi authors in the same mold of these very human-centered stories. But he also writes really, really beautifully about the environment. He got quite famous for a novel called The Overstory, which kind of takes trees as its central character. But his most recent novel is called Playground, and that one takes the ocean as one of its main characters. And the writing about the ocean is stunning. It's also about AI in a way that feels really relevant, and it has one of the coolest frame narratives that I've ever read, and it sneaks up on you how cool that frame narrative is over the course of the novel.
Very cool. I don't think I've heard of those, so I'll have to check those out. I'll add some links to the show notes so others can check them out as well. Who else from the world of film should I have on the podcast as a guest?
I think that my editor from my feature film, I had two amazing editors. They would both be great guests, Stephanie Kasnokja and Harrison Atkins. I've gotten to meet a lot of really cool short filmmakers as I've been touring around with the Sentry, and my friend Jono, who made Cattywampus. He's great. I think that he's a kindred spirit.
Wonderful. We'll see if we can get any of those folks on the podcast. And lastly, before we wrap up here, do you have any other, you mentioned that you've got some other projects lined up, anything you want to say about those? And also, where can people follow you online and on social media?
Yes, well, I have finally bitten the bullet and made myself an Instagram account, so you can follow me at jakewachtel.director on Instagram. Yeah, and check out my my feature film Karmalink, which is available on Amazon and any of the sort of rental platforms, Google Play and iTunes. Yeah, future projects. I'm working on a feature version of the Sentry. So if anyone who's watching this has any ideas of how to get that made, please hit me up. But yeah, I have a solar punk sci-fi that I'm working on, another sort of like time travel sci-fi about who controls historical narratives. So yeah, cooking up some sci-fi, big genre experiments that have a, that should be a lot of fun, but also have a lot of heart and a kind of social message at its heart.
Well, Jake, thank you so much for the time today. Thanks for sharing your film and I love getting to hear about some of the stories that went into making it. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you again to my guest today, Jake Wachtel. His film, The Sentry, has recently screened at South by Southwest London, Raindance, and the Palm Springs International ShortFest. The Oscar Project podcast is written and produced by me, Jonathan Eaterberg, with editing assistance from Joshua Eaterberg. If you want more movie coverage, check out the Oscar Project online at theoscarproject.substack.com. I'll be back on Friday with Jeff Kramer to discuss the 1929 film Alibi, and next Tuesday I'll have an interview with Emily Atkins, director of the documentary Agatha's Almanac. Until then, I hope to see you at the movies.